This is a Sigma 10-18 f2.8 for the Fuji X mount, and I've just come back from using it for 2 weeks in Lofoten, where I put it through its paces as a landscape photography lens. I've been using the Fuji XF 10-24 as my landscape lens since I switched to the system almost 8 years ago. Now, it's a great lens and I've really loved using it, but it does have one flaw, and that's the fact that it's an f4 lens, which means that when I want to shoot astro or something like the Aurora, then I need another lens with a faster maximum aperture. Now, Fuji do have the 8-16mm f2.8, but that's an absolutely massive heavy lens, and it also requires specialized filter system. And so when Sigma announced this, I was really curious, as from the specs, it looks like a good replacement for the 10-24, and with a constant f2.8 aperture, it should have the capacity to double as an astro lens, as well as being really small and light. So thanks to Sigma Portugal for lending me this lens to test it out for this review. And if you've seen my channel before, you'll know that I'm not really interested in the technical aspects of photography. I'm not a technical photographer. My reviews are based on what the lens is like from a practical point of view. So I'm interested in things like the weight, the build, the ease of use, and of course the image quality at the settings that I most often use for when I'm shooting landscapes. So this is an ultra wide zoom, a really useful lens for shooting landscapes, as it allows you to create really epic grand scenics where you can compose the whole of the scene from the foreground to mountains and the sky beyond that. 10mm is really very wide. It's 15mm equivalent on a full frame, and that is really very wide. You can see the difference here between 10mm and then something like 13mm on the Viltrox, and here you have the lower 9mm. Now, the reason I'm comparing it with those two lenses in particular is because they're what I've been using for Aurora and Astro lenses for the past couple of years, because they have the faster aperture. Now, at the other end of the zoom, it is only 18mm, which isn't as long as a 24 on the 10-24, and 24mm is a focal lens that I do use a lot, so it could mean a lot more lens changes and things like that. But for me, that's an acceptable trade-off to keep the lens so small and light. And it does also reach the widest focal length of mid-range zooms like the 16-55 or the 16-80. So with that overlap, you're never really going to be missing anything in any particular focal length, which is something that I did find occasionally happened when I went to the USA and I just had the 8mm prime and the 16-80. Occasionally I found myself wanting something in between. So having a zoom lens really does help with that. So it's a really small lens, considerably smaller than the 10-24 and a lot smaller than something like the 8-16. It's actually not that much bigger than the 8mm prime, and at just 260 grams, it's only a tiny bit heavier and quite a bit lighter than the 10-24, which makes it a really convenient lens for carrying around or for hiking in the mountains when you really want to keep the weight low. Now, it is an almost completely plastic construction, so for sure it is light, but it's not going to be as tough as the 10-24, which I've used for about 7 years now, and it still feels as good as new. Of course, it doesn't have the premium feel of a metal lens, but it does still feel pretty nice to use. There's nothing flimsy or fragile about it. And over the 2 weeks I was in Lofoten, and we were out shooting in almost hurricane conditions, driving rains, we had blizzards, we were next to the ocean, and I never had any issues with it performing. Now, it's not actually classed as being weatherproof, because while there is a seal between the camera body and lens, the rings around the lens are not sealed. As I said though, I've used it in some pretty harsh conditions, some pretty nasty weather, and it was fine. Now, there are two rings, a focus ring and a zoom ring, both of which have a nice level of resistance. It's one of the bugbears that I have with quite a lot of Fuji lenses, is that the focus ring in particular is very loose, which makes manual focusing really quite fiddly and hard to be precise. The focus ring here is nice, got a good level of resistance, and I was able to get quite precise adjustments when I was manually focusing for the Aurora. Now, there is no aperture ring at all, so aperture adjustments have to be made on the camera body itself, and that might take a little bit of getting used to if you're used to making all of your adjustments on the lens. It's with other Fuji lenses. The rings are all plastic. You don't get the rubber grips of the 10-24, but they are still really easy to operate with gloves on. They just don't feel quite quite as nice. Unlike the 10-24, which has a completely internal zoom, this actually extends through the zoom range a little bit, and it's reversed too. So when it's closed up, it's actually at 18mm at the long end of the zoom range, and it extends outwards as you zoom out to the widest focal length. And that's pretty much it for the exterior of the lens. It's pretty minimal. It has no buttons, and that means that there's no OIS activation button because this lens doesn't have stabilization. Now, how important that is to you will really depend on how important on your usage. Many of Fuji's latest generation of cameras do have stabilization built into the bodies. And wide angle lenses are generally the lenses where stabilization matters less, unlike telephotos. But it is something to bear in mind, particularly if you're shooting with one of Fuji's cameras like the X Pro or the X-T30, which aren't stabilized. Now, I don't really have that much to say about focus. It is an autofocus lens, and I found it worked fine with the X-T5, but as a landscape photography shooter, I very rarely put autofocus to any serious test, so this probably isn't the review if autofocus is what you're interested in on this lens. It does have a really close minimum focus distance of 11.6 centimeters, which is less than half of that of the 10-24. All right, let's have a look at what you can expect from the images that this lens produces. Now, as I said in the introduction, I'm not really going to dive deeply into sharpness charts at every aperture and every focal length. What's important to me and the things that I really want to know is how it's going to perform for landscapes at around f7.1, which is where lenses tend to perform better at both ends of the zoom, and how sharp it is wide open for astro and aurora shots. So I'm going to start by having a look at a few edited images. Now, I will look at some unedited RAW files later, but it's always interesting for me to look at some of the edited images because it just gives you an idea of what you can expect from the image quality that the lens is going to produce after I've run it through editing. Obviously, the better the better the sharpness, the better the performance of the lens, then the more quality you're going to be able to get out of it during processing. So this looks really quite nice. If we look around in the center, you can see this is shot at a 12mm at f64. It's not really sharp. I think something like the 8mm prime is sharper, but it's still certainly sharp enough if we look at all the detail in the center and on the mountain back there. This is another image. This one shot a little bit wider at aperture 6.4 again. And yeah, I mean, this is still sharp. It's going right down into the corners there. There's quite a lot of detail that's being pulled out. And as I said, this has been sharpened. But these looks nice. The ice looks nice. When we go through the center here, it looks really good. Plenty of detail there. Lots of detail in the shadows and in this mountain. Obviously, this has a lot of sky in it, so we're not going to see any detail in the corners. And let's just have another look at another aperture at 7.1. Again, 10mm. This is a half second, but it's taken on a tripod. And yeah, there is a lot of detail coming in here. I think as we get further back to the mountains, that's not as high detail there, but they are quite a long way away. You're looking through quite a bit of atmospheric haze. But all these trees here, there's plenty of detail. It's resolving really quite nicely. And the detail just goes all the way down into the corners here. So in terms of what the images look like once you've edited them, that's really quite nice. I just want to have a look at this last one. This is an aurora shot, although the aurora by this point was fading. This is where I managed to get into focus. Focusing for the aurora is a little bit challenging, so I wanted to have a look at this one because this was where the focus was really nailed. You can see here, this is at ISO 2500, and it's wide open at just under 13mm. So yes, there is noise here from the sensor performance because it's high ISO and there's very low light here. But you can still see that it is pulling out a fair bit of detail in these fence posts here. And when we look at the stars, there's very little comma here going up into the corner. They look quite nicely defined, quite sharp. It really does look quite nice. Now what I'd like to do is compare it with the 10-24. So you can see here on the left, we've got the Sigma 10mm f7.1, 1/125, and on the right, we've got the Fuji XF 10-24, the new version, at the exact same settings. And you can see that the Fuji is a little darker, a little bit more contrasty. I think that becomes apparent when you look at the street here, because these were taken just seconds apart. A little bit darker in terms of the exposure. Let's have a look, zoom in and look at the detail. So this is at 100%, and there's really very little difference there. Very little at all in the centers. I would say, I mean, I could look at this one and say this one looks sharper, and then I look over here and this one looks sharper. And when you can't really tell, when it's very hard to tell, I mean, looking here, this detail around where the paint's flaking off, this looks a little bit more detailed here and in this cabling, but they're so similar that it really, really is very, very hard to tell. And aperture f7.1, 6.4, as you all have seen in the images that I showed previously. That's basically where I'm going to shoot all of my landscapes. It's where I'm going to expect maximum depth of field on an APS-C sensor, and where the lens is going to perform very, very sharply. As we look down into the corner here, then you can see the quality in both lenses does drop off, just the detail around this number here. I think that the Sigma looks a tiny little bit sharper in that bottom left corner there, but it's hard to tell. Let's go over to the other side. Just looking at high detail areas like this. Not a lot of difference there. A little bit more detail in the patterns on the Sigma, but they're so similar that it really is very hard to tell. When we look in the top right, I think actually the Fuji has a little bit more detail there. So on balance, looking at these two, let's just look at, I don't think there's a lot of detail in the top left because it's sky there. Yeah, not really much difference at all. But on balance, looking at these two side by side at this aperture at the same focal length, then the Sigma performs really, really well compared with the Fuji XF10-24. I don't really see much difference at all. It's a little bit brighter. And if we look at distortion, obviously both of these lenses are corrected with the Lightroom profiles, but there's very little distortion here. If we look at the vertical and horizontal lines, there's no pincushion distortion. All of the lines are very straight, and I would say the Sigma performs really well here. Okay, this is zoomed in to 18 millimeters, which is the end of the zoom on the Sigma, and the same on the Fuji. Obviously, the Fuji can go all the way to 24 millimeters, but just to make the comparison fair, I've I've shot it at 18 millimeter. Now let's just zoom in and have a look. Now, I would expect the Fuji to perform better here because it's kind of in the middle of its focal range, whereas with the Sigma, it's right at the end, and that's where lenses do tend to drop off a little bit. But actually, again, looking at the left, looking at the detail in this plant here, it is very similar, but really not that different. I would say the Sigma is possibly a tiny little bit sharper here. Let's have a look at some of the cabling down here. Very little difference there, and we go right way into the corner looking at some of the writing on this sign. I think maybe the Fuji is performing slightly better there, a little bit contrasty, a little bit sharper in detail, but not a huge amount. Into the top, just looking at this plastic crate here, possibly slightly better in the Sigma, and then going over to the right side of the image, just have a look at the detail in these tiles. Very little difference, but if I would say possibly the Fuji is shading it here. I don't know, looking at that number. I think this particular corner in the Fuji lens maybe isn't quite as sharp. So again, very little to choose between the lenses at both ends of the focal lens for the Sigma, and I don't think you're going to be losing anything at all with the Sigma over the Fuji 10-24. And just one last image now. I want to have a look at the Sigma wide open at f2.8. Now, I would almost never shoot with the lens wide open. The only time that I would be doing that is if I was shooting Aurora or Astra, as we saw earlier. The lens certainly won't perform as well. You can see here, it's kind of sharp in the center there. It's okay, but as we get into the corner, if you look at these numbers here, it really does start to drop off quite a lot and does get really quite soft in the corners. So if you really want to be shooting this quite a lot wide open, looking at the grass in the roof and the detail, it falls off very, very quickly there, and I'm sure it's going to be the same in the other corner. Yep, I don't think it's quite as bad. It's maybe a little bit sharper on the right side, on the left side. I don't know if that's my copy. But the center is relatively acceptable, and certainly going even down to these cables, that's okay. And running these through some sharpening software like Topaz AI, I'm going to be able to get it to perform better. The corners aren't great. As a landscape photographer, that's not something that's really important to me because I'm not going to be shooting at f2.8, but it is something to bear in mind. I really like this lens a lot. For landscapes, it performs pretty much as well as the 10-24, and I do really like how small and light it is, as well as the fact that it is acceptable as an Aurora for Aurora shots. It's not super tough, but I have used it in some pretty rough conditions, and it managed quite well, so I never really felt uncomfortable using it. And so, like all things, it's about compromises, and if you feel the fact that the compact size, the lightness, and fast aperture make up for things like the lack of stabilization and the weather sealing, then it's very much worth investing in. For me, I've got some trips this year where weight is going to be really important. I've got a hiking trip coming up in Patagonia, and then a sailing boat trip in Greenland where weight is going to be really limited. And so I'm definitely going to be taking along on those trips as my wide angle lens, and I suspect that it will pretty much replace the 10-24 most of the time now. And that's pretty much it for this video. I hope it's been useful, and I hope it's been interesting. If you've got any questions at all, just drop me a comment below and I will get back to you. And of course, if you've enjoyed the video, I've got plenty of landscape and Fuji related content on the channel, so like, subscribe, and all that kind of stuff. And if you enjoy my photography and you'd like to join me on a workshop, my 2025 tours are just opening now, and I'd love to have you come along. I'll be heading to Japan, to Namibia, to Patagonia, to the Iceland Highlands, to Greenland, the Dolomites, Madeira, and we'll also be doing a tour in the US Southwest. You can find full details on all of my workshops on the website, so please check that out and drop me a line if you have any questions at all. And as ever, good luck with all your photography. Take care and thanks for watching. See ya.